How's going on here? Gaming, am I right?
Where we last left off, the ASRB was created and video games received an official rating system. Finally! I mean, it needed to happen. It was inevitable. Games were becoming just too violent, and when graphics are getting better and better, it's expected that things might get a bit realistic. Atari games? Sure, those could be anything. But Mortal Kombat? Yep, that's blood. There's no way around that. But amidst all of this, a new player entered the ring. A player that had the audacity to call the Super Nintendo and Genesis toys. Electronic Arts' founder, Trip Hawkins, with the help of 7 other companies including Gold Star, now known as LG, Matsushita, AT&T, MCA, Time Warner and EA itself, created a 3DO company in 1991, with the main objective to create the ultimate gaming system. In 1993, the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer releases. What a name for the most powerful console in the market. Also the priciest. $700. No wonder no one bought a 3DO. And Jesus, for that? These 3DO games were rough around the edges, but they did the job. The 3DO was a major flop and never reached the same heights of Nintendo and Sega. And oh, look at that, it wasn't the only one. Atari came back from the dead and released the Atari Jaguar in 1993, the first 64-bit console. Yeah, sure, and this is the first person ever to set foot on the sun. It was bogus, the Jaguar was weak as shit, but still better than the SNES and the Genesis. Nintendo and Sega were actually getting behind in terms of power and hardware. 3D games and CDs were taking over the industry, and besides Sega with their little contraption and some FX games on the SNES like Star Fox, these consoles didn't have much to offer. And it didn't get much better when Sony, after the failed Nintendo partnership, announced that they would enter the console market with the Sony PlayStation. A new console that used CDs and had pretty darn good graphics. A company as big as Sony entering the market at this point of time was terrifying, but it was expected. They wouldn't just throw their newly acquired game knowledge that they got working with Nintendo. Around this time, Sega finally made their move and unveiled the Sega Saturn, Sega's first 32-bit system. First. Yeah, for some reason Sega thought it was a big idea to release the 32X, another Genesis add-on, on the US mere months before the Saturn came out. Dumb move. I'm not even gonna touch on the 32X, it was one of Sega's biggest failures, and it was only the beginning of the end of Sega's console run. Nothing crazy. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn released in late 1994 in Japan, and they did alright. But for these first couple of months, the Sega Saturn was actually winning the console race. Cool. But what about Nintendo? They have read shit. E3 1995, the year where Nintendo finally had some news on the next generation of Nintendo. The Nintendo Ultra 64 was briefly talked about in the event, and that's it. Back to Sony and Sega. Sega of America's president at the time, Tom Kalinske, in a last-minute request from Sega of Japan, made the bold announcement that the Saturn just released in the US for $399 USD. Yup, they shadow dropped the system months before the official release. This caused some major backlash with some retailers that cut ties with Sega and said that they wouldn't sell the Saturn. Sega fumbled, but Sony saw the opportunity to make the best possible announcement that E3.
$299.
This single clip decided the entire generation's course. Sony won, Sega lost, the 3DO was dead, yup, this event was the last time we heard of them, and Nintendo was still figuring it out. Oh, here we go, the Nintendo 64 released in 1996 with Super Mario 64, the very first 3D Mario game. This game looked amazing, but it didn't matter, cause this thing released 1 year late, it still used cartridges, which made many devs switch over to PlayStation, and the controller was just bad. But even with all these factors into account, it was still doing better than the Saturn. Poor Saturn, it had great 2D games, it just came out in the wrong time. Since Nintendo and Sega already had mascots, Sony joined the fray and made what? A mascot. Crash Bandicoot from the game Crash Bandicoot. The game was great and sold pretty well, but this was more of a war between Crash and Mario 64 cause Sega cancelled their upcoming Sonic game for the Saturn. Alright, Sony was beating everyone's asses, but Nintendo was still number 1 on portable consoles. Only 9 years after the original Game Boy, Nintendo dropped the Game Boy Color, a Game Boy with colors. Not only were the games in color, but also the shell. Whoa! They weren't the first, but no doubt the first to be successful. No disrespect to the Game Gear, but that shit was terrible.
Before we go into the 6th generation, let's remember the best games of the 5th generation.
Moving on. In late 1998, Sega officially put the Saturn to rest and released the Sega Dreamcast in Japan, the first 6th generation console of the big three. The Sega Dreamcast was just insane, and releasing it with a Sonic game after a long absence of no mainline Sonic games was a breath of fresh air. The Dreamcast was doing pretty well in the beginning, even when it released internationally 1 year later. Was Sega finally at the top for the first time? Yeah, but it didn't last long, cause Sony went ahead and released the Sony PlayStation in 2000. A console that doubles the power of the PS1, that uses DVDs and doubles as a DVD player on an era where DVD players are expensive. That's just a recipe for success, but also the one for a competition killer. Not long after, in 2001, Sega announced that they would leave the console race and only focus on being a third-party dev. This was a shock, like, who would ever thought that this would happen, am I right? At the time, it was bizarre that someone that was basically there since the beginning would leave just like that. But it was for the best. But hey, at least it gave us Sonic on PlayStation and Nintendo consoles. Ew, this isn't natural. It was also around this time that Microsoft, the Windows guys, announced that they would join the console race with the Xbox, a literal PC in console form. Say what you want about the original Xbox, but this thing is powerful. In fact, the most powerful of this gen. And what better people to reveal it than Bill Gates and The Rock? What the? Moving over to Nintendo, their console this generation was none other than the GameCube. Collector's nightmare, cause this right here is very expensive now. Jesus.
Yeah, I only sold one kidney and my liver just to buy this.
And on the handheld department, we have the Game Boy Advance. Now this is an involved Game Boy in all means. 32-bit, an horizontal design, no backlight screen. But it did pretty well. The GBA is a console universally loved by everyone basically. And what Nintendo do after 3 years? A f***ing substitute. The Nintendo DS released in 2004, and initially, Nintendo said it was just an alternative for the GBA, but that's completely a lie when it discovered that the DS had a slot for GBA games. This was no alternative, this was a successor. But yeah, killing the Game Boy line must have been tough, I must say. But Sony did the unthinkable. They made their own portable console. Yup, tired of the success of the PS2, they released the PSP, a DS, better in just every way. In the 90s it was the whole SNES and Genesis discourse, but I think the biggest battle of the mid-2000s was the DS versus the PSP, and I was on the latter side. This was our 6th gen lineup. Sega left in the beginning, Nintendo did fine but they were still in the bottom, the Xbox did pretty good and the PS2 sold over 150 million copies. I think the winner is clear. But one more thing we need to talk about the early to mid-2000s was the rise of the internet and multiplayer games. Many consoles tried to incorporate that kind of stuff in the 90s, but failed. The first one that really nailed it was the Dreamcast. And after that, the PS2 did it. Microsoft launched the Xbox Live, an online service for the Xbox and Windows in 2002, which was the best usage yet. But there was nowhere to go but up. And that shows when the Xbox 360 released in 2005. But let's leave it for another time. One last time.
Finally, we're almost reaching the best part of the years of gaming, the birth of Goncalus. Can't wait for that.